Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's extra special Wednesday webinar, to the webinar of the day, which has to do with basic critical reasoning to crack the GRE verbal, right? And we have with us our resident verbal expert, Anuja Sundar, who will take over.
Thanks a lot, Sana, for that quick introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Today's verbal webinar is going to be on basic critical reasoning. Without further ado, okay, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering why I'm talking about basic critical reasoning when we're talking about the GRE verbal. And for those of you who have an idea of the exam, you probably already know that the verbal section is divided into discrete questions, reading comprehension questions, and critical reasoning type questions. It sounds like critical reasoning would be something that applies only to that last type. But the truth is, note that the GRE's verbal section is called verbal reasoning. So it is a direct application of critical reasoning for all of the question types. And what I'm going to focus on today is understanding the elements of all of these questions. And once you know all of these elements, you will be able to arrive at the core logic of any given question. That's going to help you directly crack the verbal section. So being able to identify the type of reasoning that's happening in any given question or passage by breaking it down into its smaller elements, that's what we're going to focus on today. So we're going to look at the most basic elements. And when I say basic elements, these are the ones we're going to focus on today. That is, these basic concepts. We're going to learn what a premise is. Sometimes it's also just in the form of some basic information or background information on something, but typically a premise is a little more complicated than that. I will go into the definition of all of these terms very soon. Before that, I just want to give you a list. So apart from premise, we also have assumptions, reasoning, an argument or conclusion. Typically, the conclusion is the core of the argument, right? It is the point that we're trying to arrive at. And then we have missing information, and there's also something called fallacy. So we're going to quickly look at a definition of all of these terms, with the exception of missing information. That's not really something that takes a lot of thinking to define. When I say missing information, it just means in a given passage, say there's some data provided about something to back up a particular claim, and that data is not enough, and you're looking for some other kind of data that's missing before you can arrive at a particular conclusion. That's what we mean by missing information. That's a very specific kind of concept, and it's particular only for some questions. Today we're going to focus on some of the more important concepts, which are the other ones mentioned on this slide. So let's move on to defining these concepts. Okay, so we're going to start with a premise. And what is a premise? A premise is an assertion or a proposition that forms the basis for a work or a theory. Now, I know that may not sound very clear to you in terms of definition, but basically what a premise is it's an idea. Sometimes it's an opinion. It's the belief that is behind any given argument, right? It's the core of that. It's what everything else in that argument is based on. We're going to take a look at some examples that'll make it a lot easier for you to understand what a premise is. Next, we have assumptions. An assumption is anything that's accepted as true or 100% certain, even though we don't have any proof. So what's important in an assumption is that it doesn't have proof. It lacks proof. So an assumption tends to be something that's, we leap to assumptions, whether in an argument or in real life scenarios. So it tends to be a negative aspect of any given argument. So it's important to be able to spot assumptions in arguments. Okay, so moving on, we also have these three things. We have reason. Reason or reasoning is just the cause, explanation, or justification for something. So when we say something's the reason for something, we say it's the cause, right? This is why it happened. Another thing, another meaning of reason could be an explanation. So the reasoning or why or how something happened. And finally, justification. Why did it end up happening? So what caused this, and how is it justified? Reasoning tends to provide those things. Typically, it is for the argument. So when we make a particular statement, we provide reasoning that justifies our statement. That is what we mean by reasoning. Now, what do you mean by argument or conclusion? This is the final judgment that you arrive at through your reasoning process, right? So you start at a premise. It's a basic core belief, right? And then you provide some reasoning that supports what you have just said, and then arrive at a conclusion, okay? So this is usually the structure of any given argument. Now, a fallacy is a problem in an argument, right? It is a failure in reasoning where you've leapt to some assumption and there's a problem over there, and that entire argument is rendered invalid because of this failure, because it's lacking something. Right? So a fallacy could be a generic assumption. It could also be in a lot of other kinds of forms. We're going to take a look at a couple of arguments where you can see what an assumption looks like. So I know that just looking at all of these terms and their definitions will not make all of them clear to you. So I'm going to move ahead and take a look at some clear-cut examples now. We're going to take a look at a discrete question, an RC, that is a reading comprehension passage, and we're going to look at a critical reasoning type question, all of the GRE style. And we're going to see how these basic elements are worked into those, right? How they form parts of these questions and this content. So you can see how using these elements, you can better understand the content that is being conveyed, okay? So let's move on to logical structure in an RC passage. Now, what you have before you here is an RC passage, and it's not a very long passage. I just wanted to take something short enough that we could cover in a webinar and also break down to understand its structure. So let's quickly read this passage to see what it's about, okay? Following the successful auction of her series of portraits in blues and whites in July 1910, artist Helen Michaels received the payment from the proceedings in full, yet sent a curious communication to the clerk stating that the earnings will, in part, go to a Miss Stratford, eventually sparking debate about the authorship of the paintings. All right, let's just pause and make sure we've understood what's happening over here, right? Let's just get an idea of the scenario. So what we see is that there is an artist, Helen Michaels, and she has received payment for the sale of her series of portraits in blues and whites. We can understand that this is probably, that's right, a painting, a series of paintings, right? Because we have over here authorship of paintings. So Helen Michaels is an artist who has painted this series and that has been sold. Now, what else do we know? She's received payment for the proceedings of the auction in full. She's received all the money. But Michaels also sent a curious communication, all right? She sent some kind of note or something. And what did it say? It said that the earnings will, in part, so part of the earnings, will go to somebody by the name of Miss Stratford. And what happened at this point is because Michaels asked for this money to be given to this Miss Stratford, it sparked a debate, right, about the authorship of the paintings. So why would somebody give the earnings of the sale of these paintings to somebody else if maybe that person didn't have a hand in it? So now we have this debate. Because Michaels wanted to split the money that she earned from those paintings, from the sale of those paintings with Stratford, we have the question of whether maybe Stratford could have been involved in the painting of those works, right? So that's what the sentence is giving us, right? It's giving us all this information about this debate that was sparked by an action that Michaels took after selling her paintings, right? Let's keep reading. This communication, ever since its discovery nearly 8 decades later, has been a source of much speculation that the composition of Michaels' portraits could in fact have been a collaborative affair. Okay, so this communication that we read about, right, a curious communication to the clerk, that communication was discovered 8 decades later. Okay, so this debate wasn't something that happened right at the time that Michaels did it, right? Nobody knew about the communication at that time. It was discovered 8 decades later. And what happened? It was a source of a lot of speculation about the composition of those paintings, right? Michael's, maybe the paintings could have in fact been a collaborative affair. What do we mean by collaborative? We mean more than one person had a hand in it. More than one person worked together to make it happen. So at this point, thanks to this communication, people are wondering whether Michael's painted those paintings all by herself or somebody else was involved. Who is this somebody else likely to be? That's right, Miss Stratford. After all, Michael's asked for the money to be sent to Stratford, right? So it's a pretty interesting story so far, right? We have Michael's giving up some of her money to a Miss Stratford, and because of this communication, people are starting to wonder whether Michael's painted those paintings by herself or not. Although Miss Stratford remains concealed in anonymity, okay, that means we still don't know, right? She's anonymous. We still don't know who this Stratford is. And Michael's rationale for dividing the earnings uncertain. Okay, so we still don't know the reason behind Michael's dividing the earnings. So for one thing, we don't know who Stratford really is. For another, we don't know why Michael's decided to split the money. So even though these two things are true, historians are hesitant to dismiss the possibility that the gesture was an acknowledgement of the former's direct contribution to the work. Okay, so historians, in spite of the fact that we don't know who Stratford is and we don't know Michael's reasoning for dividing the money, historians don't want to dismiss the possibility that this gesture, which gesture do we mean? Michael's dividing the money, right? They don't want to dismiss the possibility that Michael's dividing the money was actually a way of Michael's acknowledging the former. Who's the former over here? It's the first person mentioned in the sentence. Of two people, the former is the first person and the latter would refer to the second person. Over here, the first person was Miss Stratford. So the former, that is Miss Stratford's direct contribution to the work. So historians are starting to wonder, they don't want to just dismiss, maybe she really did contribute. Maybe she did something over here. Why else would Michael's want to give her some of the money? So historians want to look into this, right? In defense of the collaborative theory, so now we have a theory that this was a collaborative affair, that more than one person worked on it, that is Michael's and Stratford put in effort together for these paintings. So in defense of that theory, right, trying to defend that theory, support that theory, scholars have cited several contemporary artworks bearing not only the signature of a B. Stratford, but also lines and strokes remarkably similar in execution to those in several of the portraits. Okay, again, you want to pause, make sure you've got all of this clear, right? So we know that this idea given in this sentence is in support of the collaborative theory. It is something that tries to defend it. Now, scholars trying to defend this theory that two people worked on these paintings have cited some things. What have they cited? Contemporary artworks that bear the signature of a B. Stratford. So they're trying to link, right? Okay, so here we have some paintings that are by a Stratford. We don't know who this Stratford is, but it's possible that this Stratford is the same as that Stratford, right? And not only are these signatures here, we also have lines and strokes remarkably similar in execution to those in several of the portraits. So in Stratford, B. Stratford's paintings, we're seeing lines and strokes that look like the lines and strokes in portraits, which is supposed to be by Michael's. So now that we're seeing a stylistic similarity, we're thinking maybe this Stratford is that Stratford, and Stratford did work on the portraits, right? That is something the scholars are suggesting in support of the collaborative theory. Let's keep reading. Various documents and sketches obtained from Michael's personal effects have further revealed references to Miss Stratford in correspondences as well as acknowledgments provided below rudimentary sketches. Okay, again, one chunk at a time. We have documents and sketches being obtained from Michael's personal effects. Now, one key thing to help you tackle passages like this, make sure you separate the names and the ideas very clearly. Now we're talking about Michael's, right? Michael's personal effects. So Michael's personal stuff, they found documents and sketches over there where there were more references to Stratford in correspondences, probably letters, right? And acknowledgments provided below rudimentary sketches. What acknowledgement of what? Probably that Stratford worked on those sketches, that Stratford contributed to those sketches somehow. Okay, so all of this stuff from Michael's personal things show us that a Stratford not only existed in her life, and you can see that from some letters, but also seemed to have worked on these basic sketches. Okay, so again, what does this point support? It supports the idea of the collaborative theory, right? So both of them seem to be very close, they seem to be in communication, and Stratford seemed to have worked on some of these sketches. Right, very interesting story so far. Let's see how it ends. Nevertheless, given the merely conjectural nature of the controversy, critics have justifiably attributed the series to Michael's, noting the stylistic consistency between her other paintings and the portraits. Okay, so now we have a big turn over here. We have this word nevertheless, which suggests that, okay, we've got all of this evidence, but we have a contrast now. Given the merely conjectural nature of the controversy. So the controversy that there is this collaboration, possibly, between Stratford and Michaels, is pure conjecture, right? People are just guessing based on a few pieces of suggestive evidence. We don't even have concrete evidence. It's not like we found signatures under the paintings of portraits, right? We saw a bunch of pieces of evidence scattered in other places. So it's all conjectural. So based on that, critics have justifiably attributed the series to Michaels. So at the end of the day, critics seem to think that it's Michaels, after all, who worked on the series. And what supports that? Finally, we see that there is this stylistic consistency between her other paintings and the portraits. So Michaels seems to have done some other paintings, she seems to have worked on portraits, and they all seem a little similar in terms of style. So all in all, we see that the end of this passage, though we saw a couple of points supporting the collaborative theory, at the end, we have a statement that critics end up attributing the series to Michaels after all. So this passage seems to talk about this very unique instance that has happened that raised this particular debate. A couple of points supporting why that debate was raised and how it was justified. And now finally, we have the statement saying critics, this is what they decided because of a particular reason. Now, you might have noticed that this passage actually had a lot of logic to the way it's structured, right? We did see the introduction of the debate, and we saw a couple of things supporting a particular theory, and a final concluding statement. And that is, indeed, its structure. Okay, so if you take a closer look, you would be able to recognize that over here we have the premise, right? It's the basis on which this entire passage has been structured. The potential idea that these portraits could have been painted by two different people, right? It could have, in fact, been a collaborative affair. That is the whole basis of whatever we're going to read after that, right? And then we're going to look into these possibilities and these ideas. Why do we think so? What supports that, right? And then we can see two reasons being provided, right? One of those reasons was that we found these signatures and we found these acknowledgements, we found these correspondences. These are two reasons that supported this idea that there was a collaborative affair. But finally, we saw a conclusion that slightly differed from what the reason suggested. That can happen in an argument. The conclusion may be a little different from what is supported throughout the passage, but it's important and it's very, it's up to you, the reader, to be able to recognize that difference, right? To be able to see when the passage takes a dramatic turn. That nevertheless, that I highlighted just a few minutes ago, makes all the difference over here. That is what really turned the direction of this passage. Anybody else might have expected the conclusion to say, you know what? It's got to be a collaborative affair. But that's not what the conclusion says, right? We have critics stating something else. So paying attention to logical structure in an RC passage will help you break it up into smaller chunks, understand the role of every part of the passage in what it's trying to make, and the meaning that it's trying to make. So when you tackle questions on organization that ask you, or questions that ask you about the function of a part of a passage, like what is the point of this particular sentence? Why does the Why does the author say historians are hesitant to dismiss, right? Now you know. Because you've arrived at the logical structure, you know what role each chunk plays in trying to bring out the meaning over here. What each argument or reasoning, what the premise does, what the conclusion is for. You've arrived at all of these just by understanding that element, just by recognizing that element in the passage. So this is just an example of how you can arrive at the structure in an RC passage. It takes some practice to be able to identify what a premise is, what a reason is, and what a conclusion is. But it's very important that you do practice and ask yourself these questions as you're reading a passage. Otherwise, you would just be caught up in the flow of the passage and you wouldn't really pay attention to how something is being constructed and how it's being built, how something is being reasoned, how your mind is being altered, right? How your thinking is changing as you proceed with the passage. All of these things are done very subtly by building an argument. So the more critical you are, the easier it is for you to spot these things. We're going to take a look at the next question type, right? Let's take a look at a discrete question now. This is a text completion type with 2 blanks. I've already filled in the blanks because today what we're going to look at is the logical structure. We're not necessarily solving these questions. We're just trying to see how these elements help structure them. And yes, discrete questions also have logical structure. After all, it is verbal reasoning, and that is one core idea that I want to drive home today. So let's take a closer look at this question now. So what is the structure here? While critics have decried the fiscal inefficiencies at the company over the years, it was only the most recent accident that provided the impetus for policymakers to examine the fundamental problem of the organization. Okay, I know that if you just read without really paying attention to what you're reading, all of it can go over your head and you don't really arrive at the meaning. So let's take it slow and easy and see what it's saying chunk by chunk. While critics have decried the fiscal inefficiencies at the company over the years, let's pause. We have some critics. They have been decrying something, right? They have been complaining and about something. What is that? Fiscal inefficiencies. What do we mean by fiscal inefficiency? Anything that's fiscal is related to like government taxes. And there are inefficiencies, right? So some financial inefficiencies at a company for a long time. They have been complaining about this for a really long time. But, right, you have to keep track of all the contrasts. We saw a while earlier in this chunk, which means we can expect a contrast. Now, critics have been complaining about all this over the years. It was only the most recent accident that provided the impetus for policymakers to examine the fundamental problem of the organization. So even though critics have been doing this for all of these years, only the most recent accident actually drove policymakers to think about what the problem was, right? The company has been having these inefficiencies for a while, but one really big recent accident made people ask questions, right? It drove the policymakers to actually analyze, right? To examine what the problem of the organization was, okay? Now you may think, okay, that sounds like a typical text completion question, but what about logical structure? Actually, we do have a clear logical structure over here. You can break it up very clearly into a premise, reason, and a conclusion, right? The premise over here is the critics is the identification of the fiscal inefficiencies at the company, right? That is the basic premise of the sentence. If you pay attention, it's the basis on which the whole point is built, that the company has some problem, right? Critics have been complaining about a problem at the company. And then we have a reason supporting what is identified in the premise, right? A recent accident that basically brought it to light. Right? Critics have been talking about it. Not a lot of other people have been talking about it. So now this accident really brings it to light and drives the policymakers. That is the conclusion, right? That is the impact that this particular accident has. It's the final judgment, right? And they're going to analyze the fundamental problem. So you can see how even a very small statement could build on this kind of structure, right? Have a basic premise, a basis for the argument, and then a reasoning that builds on that, and a conclusion at which you can arrive. So even discrete questions do have these parts, and if you paid attention, when we were reading the discrete question, even though I hadn't talked about these elements, the way you work out the meaning in the sentence follows this logic. It follows this structure. It's actually very natural to us, to our minds, to break things down into logical parts and pieces. So it's something we tend to need to do in order to read something. So all you need to do at this point is identify what is what. And that's going to help you get a better understanding of what role it plays there and how you can fill in the blanks more conveniently. So if you got this structure over here, then you know that the conclusion can help you fill the blank, right? We saw that while critics have done something, it was only the most recent accident that led to this conclusion, that made people actually analyze the problem. So we know that critics must have noted it before, but it didn't do anything, and it was only the accident that actually caused this analysis, that led to people doing an analysis. So the flow of this logic can help you fill in the blanks as well. And finally, we are going to look at a critical reasoning passage as well. The reason I'm looking at one of these is because these are where you have a lot of opportunity to identify assumptions and fallacies, because most critical reasoning passages on the GRE will have some sort of assumption or fallacy that you need to identify. And you need to practice doing that in order to get better at it. So let's go ahead and read this passage really quickly and identify its parts and see if we can understand where the assumption lies. Okay, now the following is a memorandum from the manager of the Fortune Street branch of the 11 to 11 restaurant chain. So we have a restaurant chain called 11 to 11, right? A restaurant chain is just like a restaurant of the same name in multiple places, right? It's a franchise. And now this is from the manager of one branch, right? And that branch is on Fortune Street. Okay, so let's go ahead and read the memorandum. 7 months ago, when our branch of 11 to 11 decided to substitute butter with margarine, the administration expressed concerns that this would lead to customer dissatisfaction and, in turn, a drop in online ratings. However, in the recent compilation of the customer feedback and ratings for all of the 11 to 11 restaurants since this change, we have found that the number of customer complaints has been very low, and that no difference has been observed between the rating of our branch and that of other branches in the chain, proving the administration's concerns to be gratuitous. Okay, so again, very important to take this one sentence at a time. So what do we understand over here? 7 months ago, our branch of 11 to 11. So we're looking at specifically Fortune Street branch. So there's a whole bunch of 11 to 11 restaurants. One branch decided to do something 7 months ago. What's that? They substituted butter with margarine. Now, it's okay if you don't really know what these two things are. I'm sure most of us know what butter is. Even if you're not familiar with margarine, you don't have to worry about it. Just think of it as X and Y. Now, they substituted something with something else, and the administration expressed concerns. Why did they have concerns? They thought that customers would be dissatisfied, and that would lead to a drop in online ratings. So they're making a change, they're substituting something, and as a result, people think that there's going to be customer dissatisfaction, which is going to result in a drop in online ratings. What happened then? However, in the recent compilation of the customer feedback and ratings for all of the 11 to 11 restaurants since this change, okay, we have a contrast coming up. We haven't seen it just yet, but what do we know? They have compiled customer feedback. Why? They probably want to know what customers think, right? Because they were expecting them to be dissatisfied. And they've also got the ratings for all 11 to 11 restaurants since the change was done. Why do you suppose that is? Now, I would really encourage you to stop before you just keep reading and go with the flow of the passage. Stop and ask yourself why something is happening in a passage, right? Why are they looking at ratings for all of the 11 to 11 restaurants since the change, not just the one Fortune Street branch? Well, we know that they expected the ratings to go down because of the substitution, right? And it's only the Fortune Street branch that made the change. So if you were to look at all of them, probably it's to compare, right? You want to see if this rating has gone down compared to all of the others, right? Now, what did they find? We have found that the number of customer complaints has been very low. Okay, so for one thing, not a lot of complaints. For another, no difference has been observed between the rating of our branch and that of other branches in the chain. Okay, so they don't identify any difference in the ratings of the different branches when they compare. Right, so they took all the ratings and they saw that they're all more or less the same. Nobody has really noticed this substitution or change is what this suggests, right? Finally, this seems to prove the administration's concerns to be gratuitous. That means it didn't really have weight, right? It's not something we needed to worry about. So according to this last chunk, the fact that there are not many complaints and the fact that there was no difference in the rating between the different branches suggests that the administration didn't have anything to be worried about in the first place. Okay, so how many of you could spot all of the different elements or parts of this argument? It's going to be a lot easier in a critical reasoning passage compared to a reading comprehension passage, simply because all of the critical reasoning passages always have an argument. A reading comprehension passage may not always have an argument. It may be structured around something else. It may be descriptive in nature, but critical reasoning inevitably always has one. So let's go ahead and take a look. So if you recognized it, yes, we always open with a premise. And what is the premise? The premise was that if you substituted butter with margarine, then there may be customer dissatisfaction and online ratings would drop. So that's the premise. That is the whole basis on which we're thinking right now. We expect customers to be dissatisfied and online ratings to go down. What actually ended up happening, right? Since the change, there weren't a lot of customer complaints in the first place, right? The number has been low. So that's the first reason given to support what? Remember, the conclusion is that the administration's concerns were gratuitous, right? We didn't have anything to be worried about. So this reason is given in support of that conclusion, that there was nothing to be worried about, nobody's noticed a change. The next reason is that there was no difference between the ratings of one branch and that of the other branches. So putting these two reasons together, we can arrive at the conclusion that we didn't have to be worried about customer dissatisfaction. So that's a very clear-cut structure of the argument over here. It's probably a lot easier to identify in a critical reasoning passage compared to the discrete question or the reading comprehension passage. Now, at this stage, I would like for you to put in a little extra effort and try to identify what could be an assumption in this particular passage. Let's take a couple of minutes to think about it. So you have the premise, you have a couple of reasons, and you arrive at a conclusion based on that reason. It'll sound pretty solid when you read it, but if you pay close attention, you would see that there is some leap in this thinking. What is that leap? Now, what are the two reasons given to support the conclusion, right? So when you have a premise, you'd say, okay, customers are going to be dissatisfied. Now, either you prove that they are dissatisfied or you prove that they're not dissatisfied. Now, what is this argument doing? It is proving that they weren't dissatisfied. What does it offer as proof? One, a low number of complaints, and two, no difference in the ratings of one branch compared to the other branches. Now, how can we look deeper into these reasonings, right? What about these reasons? Now, keep in mind that this is a recent compilation of all customer feedback, and the number of complaints has generally been low, yes, but no difference being observed between the rating of our branch and that of other branches. That makes you really wonder, right? Now, if you were to go to a restaurant and say you notice the butter and the margarine, or you don't notice the butter and the margarine, and you go back and leave a review, are you likely to point out that this was the Fortune Street branch of 11 to 11, where the butter didn't taste so good, or it was a really good place? Or are you just likely to say that 11 to 11 in general is really good? Now, what reason 2 assumes over here is that a customer is going to differentiate between the branches of a chain when they leave reviews. But we don't really know if they do or they don't, right? Do you go and give a rating for one particular branch, or do you go and give the rating for the restaurant in general? Now, according to this reason, there's no difference observed between the ratings, but we don't know whether a dissatisfied customer went and rated that particular branch or just gave a rating for the restaurant in general. So this is not an incomplete analysis, right? it's looked at a very broad data set which can't really figure out whether or not a dissatisfied customer has complained in the right place. So there is that inherent assumption, right? And that's some really deep critical thinking. You'd have to really probe into that reason and think about how valid it is, right? So we assume that taking the rating of our branch, taking the rating of other branches, we'd know. But where's the customer in all this? The customer is the one who's got to go and have made that complaint or raised that rating. So you also have to think about those processes that happen before you arrive at that reasoning. So there is an assumption over here that customer dissatisfaction would be expressed in one of two ways: A, complaint, B, rating. Is that what a dissatisfied customer would always do? Are these two reasons enough to support that conclusion? Are there other ways that a customer may have been dissatisfied? Are there other ways to identify whether the substitution of butter and margarine is a problem or not? We don't know. None of those have been considered at all, right? The reasonings provided here is very limited. It only considers these two things. So this is how you can probe a little deeper into a particular reasoning and try to identify some assumption or problem or leap that has been made in the thinking. So it takes a lot of practice, as I mentioned, but it's a really good exercise to read, pause, and ask yourself questions as you go. So please do make the effort to break up chunks, passages and paragraphs, and even small discrete questions into different chunks, and ask yourself what role that particular chunk plays in the larger scheme of things. Now, there have been a couple of other webinars we've done, one specifically on the structure of reading comprehension passages. I would highly recommend taking a look at that webinar as well. It is available on our YouTube channel. That one breaks up different types of RC passages and how they structure their arguments or their descriptions to arrive at a particular conclusion. That is a deeper analysis, and it's more specific and pertinent to reading comprehension, but it is also an extension of reasoning skills. So please do think and work on your basic reasoning skills as you work on your verbal reasoning for the GRE. This is something that is going to help you not only for this one exam, but when you read any text and basically think about anything that you are taking in, and it makes sure that you remain critical of all of the content that comes to you instead of just accepting what you're given. So with that, I think I'd like to close, and I think Sana has a couple of other things to show you guys.
All right, so it looks like we're done for the day. Thank you so much, Anuja. And thank you to our attendees. I'm going to be closing the webinar right now. Until next Wednesday, this is Galvanize signing out.